Hello and welcome to another episode of r/ProRevenge. My name's Ryan, the official host here on Reddit Voice, and I look forward to bringing you guys today's top stories. Before I do though, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe with notifications turned on, that way you could stay up to date with all the latest and the greatest. So without further ado, let's jump into today's top stories. Never mess with a rancher and a neighbor. My father had the ultimate revenge when I was a kid. I grew up on a horse ranch in Colorado. We had a long piece of property, about 80 acres, and we raised Missouri foxtrotters. We had lived there for almost 20 years when some folks bought a strip of property way at the back of our land. It was a strange plot of land as it was very narrow and was sandwiched between our back fence and a busy country road. We were surprised anyone would buy it, actually, as it forced the house to be pretty close to said road. Well, we never met these new neighbors until one day my dad gets a notice from a lawyer telling us that after having surveyed the property lines, our back fence encroaches on their property between 3 and 6 inches, depending on the spot along the fence line. These folks had never met us, never introduced themselves. Our first introduction was this legal demand. My father was a salt-of-the-earth kind of man. Very kind, but also very strong-willed. He called these folks, arranged a meetup, and tried to talk some sense into them. First, did 3 to 6 inches really matter that much? And why had they not come to us to talk it through? He even offered a number of different compromises. These folks were hostile from the get-go. They demanded he moved the fence immediately or they'd sue. Apparently, the law stated that they had to put their house so far away from our fence line, and they wanted to push it back as far from the road as they could when they built it, so they wanted that 6 inches very badly. I still remember when my dad got home from the meeting. He hung up his hat and shook his head when he told my mom in his slow way, "Well, looks like we got the kind of folks for neighbors you don't ever want to have for neighbors." They sued and won, and we were forced to move the fence in 2 weeks. I say we because I was the free slave labor, as all farm kids are in this kind of thing. All that fencing material and the time were a big cost for my family, but we got the work done in early spring. Here is where the fun comes in. So the new neighbors broke ground and built all through the end of winter and into spring. The very next weekend, after they had moved into their house, Dad rousted me out of bed and we took the big truck into town into the lumberyard. I was extremely puzzled as we loaded up a bunch of fencing material and building supplies. We didn't have any big projects going on that I knew of, and I kept asking him what it was for, but he just told me to wait and see with a devilish smile on his face. We built a pen in a small enclosure very near our back property line, directly behind the neighbor's new shiny house. The next day, one of our farm friends delivered a half-dozen pigs to their new home. Dan insisted on feeding those hogs table scraps and all the things that would go into the composter, as well as some good balanced hog feed to keep them healthy. Now you may not know this, but the smell of pig excrement is directly related to what they eat and their pen. Table scraps make them smell bad. I mean bad. I had to drive the four-wheeler back there every day to take care of them, and within a month, halfway there, my eyes started watering, it smelled so bad. When we mucked out the pen with the bobcat, we also made the pile right next to the pen. I can't even imagine how bad the smell was living in that house. The neighbors, of course, freaked out, and again, without ever trying to talk to us, went the legal route. They lost. Area was zoned agriculture, and my dad had done his homework to make sure he wasn't breaking now laws or regulations. The pigs were far enough from us and our other neighbors that it didn't bother anyone but the people he wanted it to bother. Come fall, when winter moved in, we sold the pigs to slaughter, and Dad stacked up a bunch of building supplies next to the pen and let the neighbor know he would be expanding the profitable operation in the spring when they came out to scream at him. He smiled the whole time, speaking in his slow, steady way. The new neighbors sold their house in January when the ground was frozen and the new owners would not smell the pen. Though, as soon as the old neighbors were gone, we tore down the enclosure and spread the nasty stuff on the hayfield, and the new neighbors never had a bad smell come spring. They were also great neighbors and are still lifelong friends. Never mess with a rancher. Edit. Since I've gotten this question a bunch of times, this is what my dad proposed to the neighbor after getting the letter to move the fence, but before we ended up in court. He really did want to try to cultivate a good relationship with a new neighbor, even though they started on such a lousy foot. He offered to sell them 5 acres of land at the back of the property at a super affordable price so they could have a better plot and get well back from the road. Our back fence line was almost 5 acres long, so it would have shaved an acre-long line off is all, and that was wooded land that was not good pasture land anyway. They weren't interested. They had plenty of funds too, by the way, as they were sitting on $1 million payout from selling their home in California, which we knew as they brought it up multiple times in the discussion. Statements that they had all the money they needed to take us to court if we didn't comply immediately. My dad asked if he could move the fence over time then, rather than being hit for the cost all at once. Ranchers aren't made of money. We couldn't move the section right behind the proposed building site immediately to help with planning, etc. first. They were not willing to do that. It all had to be moved immediately. Lastly, my dad was friends with the 2 guys that did the inspection for the county for this kind of stuff. We had built many additions and changed on the ranch over time as well. They were all in the volunteer fire department together. He offered to get all of them together and see what options they had for dealing with the offset issue. The neighbor refused, again demanding the fence be moved immediately. If you see a theme here, so did my dad. There's no pleasing some people, so my dad let him take us to court. I later found out Dad was using the time to save up some money since he figured he'd have to move the fence and that was expensive. And he hoped that maybe my neighbor wouldn't push it that far and would come to work with him rather than go to all that cost. I know my dad reached out a couple more times to the neighbor before things went to court too. Taking on the Homeowners Association president. This happened when my wife and I first got married. My grandfather had passed just a couple months before and left me a very sizable inheritance with a note to make sure I use it smartly to start a good life for my wife and I. My father-in-law downs a real estate company that buys foreclosed houses and rehabs them, and he knew of a great starter home for my wife and I and agreed to pay to have it rehabbed, with the understanding that we would pay him back when we were better established or after 2 years when we sold the house. So we brought on the house, and it took about 90 days to rehab it before we moved in. This is an important factor later on. So, we finally move into our house, and had been there about 2 weeks when someone came and knocked on our door stating that they were the HOA president and asked for my landlord's contact info. I explained that we didn't rent the home and that we were the owners, and then they followed up by asking to speak with my parents. I reiterated again that I was the homeowner and asked them what they wanted. They explained that there was an HOA for the neighborhood and that I needed to sign the HOA rules and that I owned $90 prorated for my dues, but they would give me 30 days to pay as a courtesy. However, they needed me to sign the rules right then. I told them I wanted to read and review them first before I agreed to sign anything, and they were extremely pushy about signing them right then. I refused, and they told me that I had 7 days to sign them and explained that they have legal power to fine me if I don't turn in a signed copy by that time. I called my in-laws because I didn't know anything about HOAs and asked them for their advice. My father-in-law got pissed, saying that it should have been disclosed prior to the sale, but sometimes with HUD houses that gets missed. We agreed that the $30 a month fee wasn't horrible, especially because they did provide a really nice playground for the neighborhood, so I agreed and signed the rules. There were a couple that seemed a little over the top to me, but I agreed anyway because from my understanding at the time, I really didn't have a choice. It seemed fine enough until about a month passed and we had a small housewarming party with a couple of friends. Literally, there were less than 8 people there, including my wife and I. The house was small, but it had a nice deck, so we were out back having a small fire using a fire pit one of our friends just gave to us, when I heard someone knocking at the door. No, pounding like a freaking cop. I just went around the house and there was the HOA president. And his car was out front with a yellow police light on top. Yes, I'm serious. I asked him how I could help him, and he very sternly told me that I was in violation of the HOA rules by throwing a party outside of approved hours, 10 p.m. curfew, and that I needed to send my friends home or quietly take it inside. I checked my watch and it was 10:05 p.m. I was amazed, but we took it inside regardless. The next day, the very next day, I had a letter from the HOA stating that it was my official warning for violation of the HOA rules by, and I quote, throwing a wild bonfire that was a safety hazard while drinking. I literally hadn't drank at all. Whatever, I brushed it off and figured it was no big deal. Flash forward to 6 to 9 months, and we were hosting a teen group devotional for our church one afternoon, and were playing a game of football in the street. We lived on a connecting street that got virtually no traffic and only had 2 houses on it, ours and the family across from us, whose kids were also playing in the game. All of a sudden, I hear a police siren and see the yellow light flashing. HOA president gets out and tells us that we have to break it up immediately as it's a safety hazard because one of the kids could get run over. I was fed up with him and told him that they were fine and we've been watching for cars, and he was literally the first car we've seen and had been playing for over an hour at that point. He insists and asks what would happen if an ambulance or police officer needed to come down that street to save someone's life. It was stupid because literally both streets we were connected to have entrances from the main road. I gave in and we went inside. Next day, I get a letter explaining that I was being fined $60, the maximum fine allowed for a first offense, and that if I wanted to protest it, I could attend the next HOA meeting. I decide that I want to protest the fine, but noticed that the fine was due in 30 days, and the next HOA meeting wasn't for 35 days. I opted not to pay until after the hearing and wrote a letter back to the HOA president stating as such. I go to the meeting, and it's literally myself, the HOA president, the HOA secretary, president's wife, VP, president's neighbor, and treasurer, vice president's wife. My protest was immediately overruled, and I was also charged a $30 late fee for not paying on time, despite notifying him. I was fed up. I couldn't take it any longer, but realized I didn't really have any recourse. About 4 to 5 months later, we gave birth to our first child, and about a month after that, I was driving home one night, working a second job in retail at the time, and my buddy in the military called me. He had been deployed when my daughter was born and was calling to congratulate me. When I got home, I didn't want to risk waking up my sleeping newborn daughter, so I just sat in my car with the engine running as it was a little chilly outside. I sat there for about a half hour when I heard the police siren and saw the yellow lights. Now keep in mind, police sirens are not quiet, and this was right in front of my house. His stupid yellow light was flashing everywhere, including into my daughter's bedroom. I got out of the car and rather rudely told him to turn off his light as to not wake my daughter. He explained that I looked suspicious sitting in my car while it running outside of my house. I explained the situation, and he told me I had to go inside and that my history of being a troublemaker wouldn't grant me any leniency. I basically told him where I thought he could go and proceeded to sit on the hood of my car. He sat there for another 15 minutes telling me to go in, and at one point touched my shoulder. I explained to him that if he touched me again, I would take it as a sign of aggression and defend myself, which he responded to by getting in his car and leaving. He circled around the block about 4 times the next 30 minutes, which was when I got too cold to stay out and finally went inside. Next day, I get a hand-delivered letter from him and the vice president, and he also asks me to step outside to talk about last night's incident. He explains that he was being nice by not calling the police on me after I threatened him. At which point, I cut him off and told him that he needed to get off my property before I called the police on him for trespassing. I read the letter and saw that he was giving me 2 different fines for $180, which each were the maximum amounts, one for violating curfew and one for disobeying the night watchman. I was done. I had reached my breaking point. This is where the revenge comes in. I start looking into HOA laws and regulations regarding fines and how to protest them because I felt like this was clearly abuse. I find that the law states you must be notified of an HOA 10 days prior to closing on a house and must be served with HOA rules within 45 days of purchase, or you're not subject to being forced to participate in the HOA. I remembered that we weren't served until after we moved in, which was close to 90 days after we closed. So I called my real estate agent, who's a very close family friend. My in-laws have bought literally thousands of houses from her over the past 35 years, and asked if she had the paperwork still, and she said she can get me a copy. I looked over it, and it was over 90 days after my purchase, and we were notified, and there was no disclosure statement at closing. Relator says she must have misplaced it because it's required by law to be provided prior to the sale, and basically that she wouldn't miss something like that because it comes to her when they do a title inspect on the houses, whether or not there's a registered HOA. She does a little digging and calls me back 2 days later and says that my neighborhood doesn't have an HOA registered with the city or county, which is required. I end up calling the county office in charge of registering and give them the neighborhood name, and she says that my neighborhood is registered in the other city and not in our city, and that if we wanted to start an HOA, we would have to follow these certain steps. Without those, the HOA wouldn't be allowed to collect any money or have any authority. Apparently, what had happened was our neighborhood was originally all one city, but when the city lines changed, the neighborhood was split in half. The other neighbors kept the HOA that was registered, and our HOA president was supposed to register with the state, but didn't feel like jumping through all the hoops that were required. I was ready to walk down to the president's house and rip into him, but decided to be smart for a minute. I talked to my neighbors across the street who also hated the HOA and told him what I found out. He was furious about it as well. We talked to a few more and got a group of about 10 of us together that agreed to show up at the next HOA meeting. Word had apparently spread because there ended up being more people than the library meeting could host. I had specifically asked to be the speaker for the group, which they were nice enough to let me do. The president tried to prevent me from speaking due to being overdue on my fines, and at this point I'm about 3 weeks late on my last set of fines with a $30 a week penalty on each, so my current bill's about $540. But I spoke anyway. I explained to them that I had contacted my in-law's attorney, also a family friend, who had drafted together a lawsuit regarding the fact that they were impersonating an HOA in order to collect money from us, which was fraud. The president dismissed me and said I have no idea what I was talking about and that he had had enough of my antics. The staff members all left immediately while the rest of us stayed and talked. A month later, we served them formally, myself and 20 other homeowners, suing them for all fines and HOA dues we had paid, to the tune of approximately $50,000, as some of these families had been there over 10 years. The president and vice president got their own attorney who attempted to legitimize the HOA, but it required the signature of 90% of the homeowners. They got 3 signatures, including the 2 of themselves. Some other old bitter hag had signed. After that failed, they tried to settle by agreeing to abolish the HOA and showed that they hadn't financially gained from it and that all funds had been used for the park upkeep, snow removal, and other neighborhood events. We took a vote, and this was turned down in overwhelming fashion. I was surprised. I actually voted to accept this. Then, about a week later, one of the other families calls and mentions something about the park maintenance and snow removal. Apparently, he had given a quote to do the landscaping for the park, cutting grass, mulching, etc., and his quote had been a couple $100 cheaper than what they were paying, and it had always bothered him because the person who did those jobs was the VP's son, and that they were paying him outrageously in terms of what's standard. Eventually, it went to court, where the judge looked at everything and mandated that they pay $21,000, $1,000 per homeowner, plus attorney and court fees, which were like another $2,000, for a total of $23,000 in damages. Additionally, they were fined by the city's governing body after it was reported. I don't know how much that fine was, though. We ended up selling the house that following summer, but I talked to a couple friends that still lived there about a year after, and they said that the president and vice president both sold their houses and moved away because they were hated by everyone in the neighborhood, and they had an informal HOA that people donated to for the upkeep of the park. TLDR, Cranky Old Man makes up a fake HOA to put himself on a power trip, but never took the time to register it after the city lines were changed. I end up suing him along with 20 other homeowners for fraud. And there you have it, folks. The end of the epics. If you liked what you heard, be sure to leave a like as well as subscribe with notifications turned on. That way you could stay up to date with all the latest and the greatest. As always, my name's Ryan, the official host here on Reddit Voice, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video.